Welcome to everyone joining us tonight. It's good to have you here. I'm going to start the recording right now. All right, good evening, everyone. Now that we are all here and all watching wherever you are, it's good to have you here with us tonight. This is, if I remember correctly, session 6, meaning that by the end of this session, you will be halfway through the course, maybe. I always reserve the right, if I haven't had the chance to cover all the material, to add maybe one session on the back end. Since this is free, you will not be asked for more money. But feel free to always make donations if the heart moves you, if you feel this is nourishing and this is expanding your awareness. We always welcome your support to this work that we are doing. We're going to start, as always, with our Shalom chant. To invite you for now to close your eyes. And to let your attention rest with the breath. And to let yourself relax in this space, in this moment. To let go of whatever you were doing before. And to turn your attention to being together in this space. It just feels good to be able to release and relax and feel our bodies, feel into our presence, our aliveness. And from that deep center, from that groundedness within, I invite you to draw a breath for Shalom. 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 יהיו לרצון אמרתי, והגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני. Holy One of Being, help us to know your presence, to know your guidance through this night, through this course, through this moment. May the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts might flow from the fullness of your being, Holy One. Adonai Tzuri v'Goali, help us to remember that you are that which shapes us, and you are that which liberates us. Amen. Good. So we have a lot of territory to traverse this session. So we'll just jump right in if you don't mind. So where are we? After all this time, we have now reached the end of 1918. We have reached the end of the First World War, and we've seen that the Allies have won. We have discovered once again that Russia is now a communist country. We have seen the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapse, as well as the Ottoman Empire. By the end of this session, we will make it to 1921. So we'll cover about 4 years, just like we did in the previous session, which means that by then we would have traversed from 1881 to 1921. We would have covered 40 years of this history. Of course, to me, and maybe at this point for you, it feels to me a little bit like the first Aliyah, that those first 20,000 Jews who eventually will stay in the Promised Land. I don't know if we can really include them in in the history really of what Zionism was. Of course, we're not going to exclude them, but to me, it's kind of this transition group between yet another group who has come back to the Promised Land like we have over the centuries, and a thin, narrow group of them actually came with those Zionist ideals, with those nationalist ideals, but there were very few and far between. So it's really that that generation, that first Aliyah is kind of the in-betweeners, the in-between. There are still remnants of all the other Jews who had come back to the Promised Land over the centuries, but they're also the first seed of what we would come to know as Zionism. So that's our goal for tonight. We will try to do yet another 4 years in our historical progress. So at the end of the war, Britain had defeated the Ottoman Empire and now stood with its 200,000 soldiers as the sole conqueror of the Middle East. Faisal, who is one of the sons of Sharif Hussein, which we encountered in previous sessions, the king of Hejaz, of a sliver of Arabia, who has led the Arab revolts. Faisal was one of the sons of Hussein who led the Arab revolt alongside the British armies, has now set up an Arab government in Syria, which included, if you recall from the maps in the previous session, both the vilayet of Aleppo and the vilayet of Damascus. And the government that he sets up there declares Sharif Hussein, his father, king of the Arabs, and this government will eventually crown Faisal king of Syria in March of 2020. Now, here's what Faisal kingdom would have looked like on a map. I want to show this to you because if you don't really have the sense of the map, you don't really exactly can know what I am talking about. So I'm going to share the map right now. Hopefully everybody can see it. See if I can make it bigger like this. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. There you go. That looks better. All right, so if you remember, there was a map like this that showed, I'm going to use my cursor here, that showed all of that, the coastal lands, right, to be said to be for the British and eventually the French. But there was all of that side of the Middle East that Faisal is now claiming to be the king of. So the vilayet of Aleppo and the vilayet of Damascus or Syria, right? The vilayet of Az-Zor is going to be more disputed here, the yellow part, but basically the son of Hussein declares himself king of all this part of the Middle East at that point. And understand that this is conquered by Britain, right? But nonetheless, Faisal declares himself king of that part of the land. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's going to be important as we continue our exploration. Keep that picture in mind. It will be included as part of the maps that you will receive um, alongside the recording tomorrow. So as you keep this in mind, store it in the back of your mind. It's there. Now, in early 1919, right, the peace conference, post-war peace conference, begins in Paris. And it will unfold really over a year and a half. And through that year and a half, different treaties will be entered into in different places. Its main achievements will be the 5 peace treaties with the defeated nations of the Central Powers of the First World War, including the infamous Treaty of Versailles, which is signed with Germany. It also includes the transition of German and Ottoman foreign possessions, foreign territories, as mandates. That's a new term, mandates that chiefly fall into the hands of Britain and France, right? Another thing that happens during that time, during that year and a half, is the creation of the Society of Nations. That also happens in 1920. And that's going to be important in the history of Zionism, of course. That's why I'm mentioning it. The Society of Nations, I don't know if you remember from your early school days, but it was kind of the international body, kind of the earlier version, which actually was a failed version of what the United Nation is today. And we can discuss whether the United Nation is or not a failure, but it's kind of the same idea. The Society of Nations, created in 1920, will be the body that will oversee the implementation of these mandates given, as I said, mostly to France and to Britain. The mandate of Palestine will be specifically, the one that concerns us, will be agreed upon in the Conference of San Remo in Italy on April 25th, 1920. But let's go back once more to the end of 1918. I want to go back to 1918 because something fascinating had happened in the weeks leading up to the start of January 1919 and the peace conference in Paris. At that time, and I think I mentioned it last session, at that time, Prince Faisal had just begun his strategic positioning towards his father's vision, if you remember, of a pan-Arab state that the Hashemite family, the family of King Hussein, would in fact rule, right? So Prince Faisal is kind of the leader of the tribe, if you want, who goes to Paris, who goes to the peace conference with kind of a mandate from his father to try to negotiate with the powers that be that vision of a pan-Arab state that would encompass the entirety of the liberated Middle East from the Ottoman forces, right? And that's where he is also trying to make his claim during the peace conference on this Syrian kingdom through the Syrian vilayets that I showed you on the map. But at that time, right, early 1919, nothing was yet certain. And so the peace conference would be an opportunity for him to close the deal, basically, right? To reason with the great powers and kind of force their hands to accede to his father's demands. And for their own reasons, Weizmann and the Zionist movement felt that the conference could also be a great place for them to lay their claims, their own claims to the portion of land that they were interested in. And so paradoxically, it seemed that a potential alliance between those two forces ahead of Paris could really further the interests of those two, I would say, minority parties at the conference. And so both the Zionists, Weizmann as their leader, and the family of Sharif Hussein with Faisal as their leader, who both had been allies to the British war effort, both laid claims to parts of the Middle East, figured out that they could, in fact, support each other in achieving each of their goals by working together towards developing a prosperous region in that part of the world. And the truth is that at first, Britain didn't oppose such potential cooperation. In fact, it encouraged it because in the early stages, as that became more and more actualized, the British believed that it would ease their ability to rule over the vastness of the territory that was the Middle East, and that had fallen onto their lap at that point, right? Faisal, Faisal thought that the Zionist Jews could help him financially and could also bring their expertise to further progress in the Arab world. And so Faisal and Weizmann meet in London in December of 1818, so just weeks before the beginning of the peace conference in Paris, and agree to cooperate in developing Palestine and what would eventually become the great Arab state. It's quite fascinating. At that luncheon, they had a luncheon as part of the negotiation of the treaty. Faisal is known to have said, and I quote, "No true Arab can be suspicious or afraid of Jewish nationalism. We are demanding Arab freedom, and we should show ourselves unworthy of it if we did not now, as I do, say to the Jews, welcome back home, and cooperate with them to the limit of the Arab state." That is what the king of the Arabs, as the Syrian had called him, as the Syrian temporary government had called him, that's what the king of the Arabs of the time declared on the national stage as the negotiation between Weizmann and himself were ongoing. It's quite astonishing, quite astonishing. The agreement was eventually signed between them on January 3rd, 1919. And you will read that agreement as part of the readings for this session. And it's quite remarkable. I think the dating, so I got that from a university website who probably was teaching a course on history. But I think their copy over of the document had the date wrong at the end. So it is for sure January 3rd, 1919. And you will, I hope you won't forget, but when you read the document, hopefully tomorrow or in the days that follow, note, so the document that I am sending you is actually Faisal's copy. And note what he writes at the bottom of the agreement there. He adds a little something on his copy that is very interesting. So I will leave you to discover that for yourself. On February 5th, so just a month after Weizmann and Faisal signed that agreement, Faisal appears before the peace conference in Paris to demand Arab independence, and to also, at that time, lay his claims to the Syrian vilayets of the map that I showed you. Now, of course, you can imagine that this was kind of a shock. I don't know if was contradicting what secretly France and Britain knew, because there was this secret agreement between those two great powers, the Sykes-Picot agreement, and both powers had already pre-divided the Middle East, as we saw, and that France was to rule over Syria, and therefore Faisal discovers and is made aware of the Sykes-Picot agreement during the conference. Now, you can imagine that he was quite unhappy with that. Now, Weizmann has also come to the conference with his own map and his own territorial claims, which he also submitted to the conference in February as well. I guess both of them were invited to present their claim at the conference at the same time. So I showed you what Faisal's claim was at the conference. Let me show you what what Weizmann's claim was. So I'm kind of going to do the same. I'm going to show you here and share my screen. This is the map of future Palestine, I guess you would say. Let me see if I can make that bigger. I'm going to move that. See if, there you go. I think that should do it. All right, here is the Zionist plan for Palestine submitted at the peace conference in February of 1919. Right? This is what the Zionists, this is what Weizmann wished to see set aside for Jewish settlement. Again, understand that he was working in in tandem with Faisal. So, Faisal was very happy to have the Jews have a little part of the big Arab kingdom, as we saw in his declaration, as you will read in their agreement. So I think Weizmann was like, well, let's see what we can get. And you can see that knowing the borders of Israel, Weizmann proposed a map that extended into what we understand today to be Jordan, on the right side of the Jordan River, almost getting very close to Amman. Amman is the capital right here of Jordan right now, and also into southern Lebanon and parts of Syria as well. So Banyas, Quneitra, Metula, those are today possessions of the state of Israel. This is the Golan Heights right here. Tyre right here is already in Lebanon, right? So this is part of Lebanon. Okay, Sidon, all that. All right, so a little bit, maybe we didn't know that, but that was the aspiration of Weizmann. at least in his proposal to the peace conference. And he was, if Hussein is going to ask for everything else, maybe we can we can ask for that part. Why not? Why not? You can always ask and see what happens. And Faisal, as he learns about the Sykes-Picot agreement, turns to the Jews in hope that the Jews and Weizmann would join him in opposing the French, since the Zionists and Weizmann themselves were disputing the French claim of southern Lebanon and the northern Galilee that was included in the Sykes-Picot map, if you remember it from a couple of sessions ago, right? And so Faisal thought, well, Weizmann is not going to like that the entire northern part of his plan is going to be chopped off. So maybe he will join me. We can join forces to oppose the French. But Weizmann was between a rock and a hard place with that, because um, he understood that if the plan between Britain and France was going to move forward, and most likely that was going to be the case, some of those early settlement that had positioned themselves that far north in the Galilee and the feet of Mount Hermon, he would need to make sure that his relationship with Great Britain, his relationship with the British Empire, remained intact in order to, because his relationship was primary with Great Britain, especially with the Balfour Declaration. Like, he was really betting on the British government to follow through with their promise still at this point. Little did he know, as we will discover. And so in order not to upset Britain as, the de facto patrons of the Zionist project, in order not to upset Britain and their dealing with France, Weizmann was unable to side with Faisal against Britain, and advocate on behalf of both of them. And so, needless to say, Faisal was unhappy with that. Both Faisal and Weizmann's proposals were flatly rejected at the conference. Neither one of them got anything at all. And, by mid-1919, Faisal terminated his contact with Weizmann and the Zionist movement altogether. And in some of his declaration, he said that, he would perhaps consider a Jewish national home as a small province of his Arab kingdom, were that to become a reality. Kind of, throwing little crumbs in his magnanimous kingship. Now, what is important to note is that Faisal was not representing the Arabs of Palestine. He was representing himself and his family, his clan, his father, and their claim to the Middle East. As I mentioned earlier, he still went ahead and eventually was crowned king of the Greater Syria that he claimed in March 2020, so about a year after he came before the peace conference in Paris. So he forged ahead. He forged ahead. Besides, understand that the Arabs of the Middle East at that time, right, post World War I, still understood themselves as citizens of these many vilayets, right? These many regions, different regions. And that will remain the case even post-peace conference. And that will also remain the same through the designations of those mandates I've talked about, where finally lines are drawn in the sand and states are created. But we need also to point that the rise of what we would discern and name as Arab nationalistic consciousness come through Faisal and his efforts in demanding Arab independence from the great powers, right? So this is really the pivotal moment through Faisal and his demands that are, you can imagine, widely publicized throughout the Middle East, that there is a seed that is planted amongst the Arabs that they exist as an Arab nation, right? That there is a nationalistic sense that is born out of Faisal's own fight, if you want, on behalf of his own clan and his own tribe to create this pan-Arabic state, right? So scholars agree or argue that we can trace the birth of Arab nationalist consciousness to these efforts. Now, it became clear at the peace conference that France and Britain were set on honoring the Sykes-Picot Agreement. That's besides the fact that, as we saw, British already had reneged on this international rule over Western Palestine, and were actually at that point demanding the Mosul Vilayet that will later be included in the creation of Iraq. What France and Britain ultimately wanted to avoid is what Sharif Hussein and his son Faisal were advocating for, that one pan-Arab state across the entire Middle East. So jump a year. The agreement at San Remo in April of 1920 split the Middle East into three different areas. In the north, you have Syria, which includes what we would understand today to be Lebanon and Syria, south of Turkey's border. Mesopotamia, which would basically include, all of Iraq, and then, parts of the Arab Peninsula and going toward the south of Iran, right? For those of you who know the map, that's where it's like a big kind of an S that goes down like this, right? And then you have Palestine. Now, France would control Syria, which is Lebanon and Syria today. Britain would control Palestine and Mesopotamia, putting Mesopotamia under what they called a provisional government, under the rule of Faisal's brother, Prince Zaid. And I'm wondering if your head is spinning already, or if you're still tracking, because there's a lot of moving pieces here. But that's what San Remo does in April of 1920. They split the Middle East into three. There will be more splitting, but for now, there is France in the north, Syria and Lebanon. There is the British rule over Palestine, the British overseeing over Mesopotamia, but inserting there a provisional government under the rule of Faisal's brother, or another son of Sharif Hussein, whose name is Prince Zaid, and he is the one put in charge of governing there for the time being, right? So a lot of pieces are moving through this year and a half of the peace conference in Paris. Now, Faisal is himself not gonna put down his demands, and as the French begin to come into the mandate that they were just given, Lebanon and Syria, as they start to disembark and bring their troops and start to take over, Faisal declares war against the French. And over the next 3 months, for 3 months, so between March and basically June of 1920, there is a war between Faisal and his Syrian forces against the French armies. And the French defeat Faisal and expel him from Syria. Okay? So the short-lived king of Syria not only no longer has that territory, because all the southern part of the map that I showed you that he proposed at the peace conference was given to Britain no matter what, right? But the leftover northern part, the vilayet of Damascus and Aleppo, now fall under French rule. The war ensues. He's defeated and he's exiled from Syria altogether. Now, if you're worried about him, if you're worried about what happened to him, I would just close that part of our story and let you know, between you and I, that at a later year, sometimes after, actually at the start of the mandate, when the states of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Palestine are actually created, and the previous area of Mesopotamia basically cut apart, reshuffled, Prince Zaid yields power to his brother, and Faisal is in fact enthroned by the British, by Britain, as king of Iraq. Right? So there you have it. He lost Syria, but the British maybe felt bad for him. They removed his brother Zaid and they put him as king of Syria. So he didn't get all that he wanted, but he still became king. So maybe he lived happy ever after. I don't exactly know, but at least he became king of Iraq. That was actually not an easy job to be king of Iraq, because Mesopotamia, as I said, included parts of what we would know as Iran, meaning that included in Iraq to this day, as we know from the Iraq War, there were a lot of Shiite. There was a strong Shiite minority that became included into the Kingdom of Iraq, who was majority Sunni, and Faisal was obviously as Sunni as well. So, he was kind of a difficult kingdom to manage because of the tension between the two Muslim factions. As these new boundaries were clearly drawn by France and Britain, one thing that is important to know is that the map of Palestine under the British Mandate is not what we think of today as the State of Israel and Palestine. So this is something else that I need to share with you so that you also have a sense of what we are talking about exactly when we say Palestine at that time. So this is Palestine, right? So you see that Palestine wasn't just the territories on the left side of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, but that was Palestine. That was what we were, when we were talking about the British mandate for Palestine, that is what we were talking about. So the Balfour Declaration, right? So that's April 24, you see on the map at the bottom here, April 24, 1920. That's the ratification of the treaty in San Remo, right, that I mentioned earlier. And that's the mandate that is given to Britain. You can see that Iraq is also created at that time, and Syria and Lebanon in the north of Palestine are also created at that time and given to the French. But understand that for Weizmann, for the Zionists, when Balfour's declaration said, right, that Great Britain was vowing to create a Jewish home in Palestine, that is what Palestine was understood to be. So it makes a little more sense now in this context to see why Weizmann felt that he could present the map at the peace conference that he presented, right? Because again, for him, maybe it was like, oh, we can split this into two. And if you kind of look at the borders that he had, that would have split the Palestine into actually two. So it's not too far-fetched that he demanded what he demanded either, if you understand that this is the map of Palestine as was understood at that time in 1920. And that's the British mandate, okay? That's the British mandate. So when we talk about the mandate for Palestine, that is what we talked about at the time. It's important to realize that. It's important to realize that. All right. Now, I want to open a parenthesis in our narrative here. And I want to briefly talk about it. We'll come back to it, but I also want to briefly talk about the rise of Palestinian Arab nationalistic consciousness as it came to be in these early post-World War I years. Sharif Hussein and Prince Faisal, in their search for Arab independence, that search, that push toward Arab independence happened in the background of the conquest of Arab lands by non-Muslim infidels. We cannot forget that, because the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans, even if they didn't like them, right, were welcome and tolerated, and they had for hundreds of years, because they were also Sunni Muslims, right? But here, in this moment in history, you have, I don't want to bring us back 1,000 years, but we have basically Christian crusaders, right, that are once again taking over the land, right? These are Christians taking over Muslim lands. And so in the struggle that will unfold, we need to also keep that in mind. This is a really critical piece of the puzzle that we can't ignore, right? This rise in need of independence is also a rise in need of independence as against Christian rule. It's very different than Muslim rule of the Ottoman Empire. And if you remember me talking about this earlier, under the rule of the Sultan in Istanbul, under Ottoman rule, Jews and Arabs did not dare express nationalistic hopes, right? among the Arabs, such kind of consciousness was, you could say, at best, embryonic, right? And the Jews, in the context of Ottoman rule, limited themselves very much to focus solely on their socialist, political notions and ideals of labor and of living off the land. That's what they limited themselves to officially and publicly concern themselves with. None of those, none of the people of the land ever spoke out loud about any notion of nationalistic consciousness because they knew that he was under Ottoman rule. He wasn't going to go anywhere. This was the Ottoman Empire, and so it was, right? The British occupation, however, seemed to immediately open that Pandora's box. Suddenly, both communities start to speak out loud of nationalistic ambitions. Um, Articles are published in newspapers in Hebrew, in Arabic, and both become, because of that, acutely aware of each other, the Jews and the Arabs, and acutely aware of a possible struggle ahead. With British rule, Jews overnight, it's also very critical to understand, with British rule, overnight, the Jews' status changed from being dhimmis, and I mentioned that at the beginning, right? Up until the dismantlement of the Ottoman Empire and the conquest of Britain, right? Jews were dhimmis under Ottoman rule, meaning that they were tolerated infidels under Muslim rule. They were second-class citizens, right? With British rule, that status of dhimmi changed completely, is erased altogether, and now they become equal competing rivals for the land and for the influence of the new rulers over their plans for their conquered land. That is also very important to understand, very critical to understand. So, one, the new rulers are not Muslims. Two, because they are non-Muslim, the social status of the Jews is no longer a second-class citizen. Now they are equally fighting on the same footing for their nationalistic claims. Right? Before that, the Jews were there for sure, but they didn't have any ability to move their their goals forward as second-class citizens. So, this newfound, uh, you know, this new, gaining equal citizenship, basically, almost equal citizenship, is going to give these Jews now in Palestine confidence that they didn't have before. And the Arab population are going to see now this very vocal Jews as insolent. They couch this because for them, they're still infidels, and they see this more how do we say, more enthused Jews as insolent. They're chutzpahdik. And on their side, this newfound sense that they too could own the land strengthen Arab fears, strengthen, in fact, Arab nationalistic identity, right? because the Jews now are like, oh, we don't need to be, we're no longer a second class citizen. Then we could rightfully really claim ownership of the lands that, that we find ourselves on now, even though, the Jews had bought that land, but, it was always more precarious when you were second class citizen, even if you had the title of the land, that really didn't mean much. But now it meant a lot. Now it meant a lot. Um, so I'm going to make sure everybody stay muted. Please stay muted so that we don't have sound interference. And so that newfound confidence in themselves, of the Jews, right, brought up a lot of fears in the Arab, and also brought up that sense of nationalistic identity. Now they need to compete with the Jews on a different level that they didn't have to up until this very moment, right? And the Jews noticed. The Jews noticed the shift, right? And they noticed even more because what happened was that at first, the British occupying military forces brought their military administrators back from Egypt. And these administrators, these military administrators, were accustomed to dealing with a Muslim majority, and in Egypt, overwhelming majority. And so, because of their facility with Muslims and having worked with Muslims for years and years and years, they basically ignored the Jews. They dealt with the people they knew how to interface with, and they ignored Jewish needs, especially when it came to security, in the early violent reactions of Arab nationalism. And so you can see in the Jewish press of the time, uh, articles talking about Jewish fears and Jewish anger toward the military rule over Palestine at that point, anger and fears that are being, pushed all the way to London, and complaints that are now arriving on the desk of the foreign minister of the time. Now, another thing to mention, as we set the context of these years, is that the Ottoman forces, as they were retreating, they left huge amounts of light weaponry behind that the Arabs of the land grabbed as they could. And so with that, 1919 and 1920 saw a sharp decline in Jewish physical security. In fact, the land reached a state of quasi-anarchy, with gangs of armed men roaming the countryside, Jews murdered in their fields from time to time. That became almost a regular, happening in the land. You would see marauding Bedouins attacking Jewish settlement, stealing cattle, stealing machinery. It was clear to the Jews that the British forces at the time did little, if nothing, about it. And it became also clear to the settlements, to Weizmann and the Zionists, that the Arabs would violently oppose Jewish national ambitions in the land. And if during Ottoman rule, the notion of borders was meaningless, and I want to emphasize that during the Ottoman rule, the notion of borders was meaningless because they ruled over everything. They were vilayets, right? They were regions, but that didn't translate into borders or anything like that. So there was no notion of borders. Now the notion of borders becomes the hottest topic in Palestine, with obviously the British commitment to creating a Jewish national home there. Now, what was new and different for the Jews was that wherever they settled to farm the land, at this point, it was not just, oh, just, find an available piece of land that belongs to no one, or, you can buy from the Sultan and put your, do everything you can to make that a successful farming endeavor. Now they started to think about borders. That was a new dimension in their strategic thinking. And so it was not just let's put a farm wherever we can. It was like let's put a farm where it will have an influence on the future drawing of borders. Geography mattered tremendously from that point forward. Arab nationalism, on the other hand, expressed their aim that was to prevent, if not stop altogether, any Jewish settlement from spreading. And one of the things that they imposed, and I'm talking about the leadership, right? One of the things that the Arab nationalist leadership imposed on their people is that a ban on selling any tract of land to Jews. And this, in turn, as you can imagine, was felt as a great threat to the Jewish community, especially when it came to these early farms that had already been created and were somewhat isolated from the greater concentration, if you'd like, of other Jewish farms in the land, right? They had a great sense that those farms, the settlement that were more remote, people living there, their lives was now in danger. They were also greatly concerned and afraid of, fearing that their tiny foothold on the land might be shrank to nothing because of the Arab reaction, and would become unsustainable, really. Now, to make matters worse, the retreating Ottoman forces, who not only left all kinds of guns behind, they took away with them all the administrative land records that existed at that time. And that brought up great concern and great fear on both sides, really, as to, since geography was now the greatest concern, who could prove owned what, right? Because the Ottomans, they packed up their administration and they brought everything back to Turkey. So now what? I mean, maybe you have a paper in your hand, but there is no, you can't prove, there is no second, there is no carbon copy of it or whatever they did at the time. So this is kind of it feels really, as I'm talking about all this, like things are really sitting on a very sharp edge. Like it feels like all the components are there for things to blow up. Like it's become really unsettled. And understand also, as you will read, but you read probably from last session, the that Palestine was desolated. It was a desolate place. The impact of World War II on the communities there were devastating. It was not a very prosperous region of the Middle East to begin with. The Ottoman Empire never really invested anything to try to make the land prosper, or to support, administration, roads, infrastructure. there was very little there. And then the war came, and that was even a greater blow. So that is also, there was great poverty um, at that time, near famine. In fact, if you read the chapters about the war there, I mean, there was starvation happening all over the land. So it was also precarious in that sense. People were not at their best. People were struggling mightily, and all of that puts the place really on a very sharp edge. And so you can't help but see examples of eruption of nationalistic violence. And that's what we see happening already in 1920. We mentioned a couple sessions ago the attack on Tel Hai. You will revisit that through our readings this week. Tel Hai was actually one of those somewhat isolated settlement I was talking about. That the Zionist movement was really concerned. We're in danger now, and you will read more in depth, especially, I mean, from Sachar's books for sure, but Segev's really have um, dedicates this book. Actually, I will have excerpts of the book sent to you. So even if you haven't had the chance to buy the book yet, you'll be able to read a few of those chapters that talk specifically about the attacks on Tel Hai, but not just Tel Hai. Um, there's another major attack that I'm gonna briefly mention here. In 1920, in April of 1920, just before, and actually connected to it being just before the signing of San Remo at the end of April, during the holiday of Nebi Musa in um, uh, in April 1920, and then a year later we'll see, and you will read about another attack on the Jews in Jaffa a year later in 1921. Um, so we already spoke of Tel Chai, so I won't go back to that. I'm going to just talk about Nebi Musa. Nebi Musa is a spring pilgrimage holiday that always falls around Easter and Passover, where Muslims from gather mostly in Jerusalem and have this little pilgrimage to down the road toward the Dead Sea to the outskirts of Jericho, where Nebi Musa, which translates as prophet, Nebi, Navi in Hebrew, Musa, Moshe, Moses in English, prophet Moses, right? There is a pilgrimage site near Jericho where Prophet Moses, Nebi Musa, Prophet Moses' grave is believed to be. So the pilgrims gather in Jerusalem on April 4, 1920. And as they gather ahead of the short pilgrimage to the outskirts of Jericho, to the tomb of the prophet Moses, Nebi Musa, they are met with nationalist agitators whose sole aim is to initiate some kind of riot in Jerusalem to influence the upcoming San Remo conference. The crowds responds immediately to the goading of the agitators. And when the Arab police joins in, the planned riot suddenly erupt, and the rioters tear through the streets of the old city of Jerusalem, and there they find their victims in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community at the time sits there defenseless and is the easy target of Jews by the Arab mobs who basically attack them in their homes on the streets of the old city. Because, not only, I mean, paradoxically, not only are they defenseless, they are defenseless, first of all, because I mean, their homes, their apartments, they live next door to the Muslims. They are not Zionists whatsoever, as we understand from this course. They came for religious reasons. They came to inhabit the holy cities. Most of them don't speak Hebrew. They speak, if they came from Eastern Europe, Yiddish. If they came from Arab or Spanish lands, they speak Ladino or even Arabic, in fact. But and of course, they never thought to learn to defend themselves, so they are easy targets for the rioters, and that's very important for us to mention that many of those riots are not going to target the Zionists, even if Arab nationalists will say, no, no, we only oppose those Jews from the Zionist movement. In fact, they continue to attack defenseless, religious, non-Zionist, non-Hebrew speaking Jews. And that really proves their claim wrong, to say the least, right? In fact, we know from history that contrary to that claim that, oh, no, no, we only are against the Zionist Jews, very little to no effort was made to differentiate between the two. They will continue to attack non-Zionist religious communities. We'll see that in future sessions, not just in Jerusalem again, but in Hebron, in Safed, in Tzfat, in the north, and really in all these holy cities where religious Jews live and are easy defenseless targets. Um, you know, not only defenseless, but easy to find because they're basically the neighbors of the Arab attackers. So they knew exactly where to find them. He was kind of, I would say, sad, but it's worse than that. What this proves, so these repeated attacks, so we have Tel Chai in early 1920, we have Jerusalem, Nebi Musa in April of 1920. A year later, there's another attack in Jaffa and the neighborhood cities, Jewish cities around Jaffa. It proves to the Zionist leadership that survival was linked to the Jews' ability to fight back and defend themselves, which, as we have seen, brought about the organization of the First Corps of Jewish Defense Forces. Now, just a few words about Jaffa. And you will read all about it. Start with Sachar this week. Always start with Sachar. He's kind of your overview. And then if you have time and you want to delve further into some of those topics, then go with Segev, and then you'll see there is another from Shapira that I included this week. Jaffa. So the riots in Jaffa take place almost exactly a year after Nabi Musa in May of 1921. And these riots target actually Eastern European new immigrant who were in contradistinction both, compared to the religious Jews of the old city of Jerusalem, they were both modern and secular Jews, right? In fact, they were that sharp contrast to the first Aliyah religious Jews, or to be clear, the local religious Arab inhabitant, right? Now imagine that you are a religious person, from deep ancestry, right? And in near your town now, yeah, you have these young Eastern European Jews walking around, completely revealing in what you would call inappropriate clothing, right? I mean, imagine living in Israel under the sun, right? You're not used to it. What are you wearing, right? So you see young men and young women wearing pants, wearing shorts, short sleeves shirts, right? You see, modern life expressions. After all, it's the 1920s, right? So you see couples holding hands on the streets. You see probably public displays of affection, right? What for us would be completely normal, right? Now, these young Jews with their socialist beliefs, on May 1st, what do? Well, they put together the celebration of the 1st of May, which is a socialist holiday, and they decide to have a parade, right? The parade, a labor parade through the center of Jaffa. Now, that was enough, as you can imagine. That was enough of a pretext for Arab nationalists to call for a riot in opposition to this parade. And that riot became extremely violent, spread beyond Jaffa to the neighboring towns and farm colonies. And when eventually 7 days later, to tell you how the British forces didn't really jump to restore law and order, 7 days later, the British police finally arrives to stop the attack. By the time they arrive, 47 Jews and 48 Arabs are dead, and dozens and dozens and dozens more lay wounded. So again, were those European Jews provocateurs? I don't want to get into the debate of, you were dressed this certain way, so you deserved it. We could have that conversation. But again, I mean, keep in mind that just a few months earlier, right? Even the most appropriately dressed, ultra-Orthodox, non-labor parading Orthodox Jews were just as much victims of the Arab mobs than these Jews were in Jaffa, right? And we will see that this will multiply in few years later. So I still mention that, to give us kind of a sense of maybe there was, resentment on the part of the religious Arab society that we need to take into account. There was a sharp contrast for them, and they may not have approved of it, right? Again, it's like those Jews were dhimmis just last week. Now they feel, emboldened by equal citizenship. So there was all kinds of resentment boiling underneath it all. But what we can really say from this succession of multiple riots was that the Jewish targets seemed to always be what's the closest at hand, right? It was not really like thought through or strategically planned. It wasn't like, okay, which Jews are we going to target in order to make our point? It was just like, oh, there's an opportunity. They're going to do this labor parade. Let's use that to create unrest. It's really what it feels like. It's not organized, right? For good or for ill. In this case, for ill. So what we are left with is again being confronted with challenging questions, such as we are confronted with to this day. Had the Zionists be more respectful of Arab customs, had the Zionists tried to integrate more with the local population, wouldn't have tensions between the communities been drastically reduced, right? Each of us will have to find our own answer, but historically, since this is about history, we've seen that the Jews came to Palestine to define themselves. And in fact, to make sure that they are no longer letting themselves be defined by others, by the others that are, the majority. So where they're supposed to conform to the local social cultural norms that, in fact, to be honest, right, were completely foreign to them, just in the hope of calming possible tension? Was that something that we could have asked of them? Did they not have the right to behave and be who they were, even if that antagonized the local Arabs? I mean, we can ask those questions as well. And if we say no, are we saying, therefore, that the Jews should have simply acted as dhimmis all the time, forevermore, in order to remain, unnoticed, to blend in? And was that the only way for Arabs to have, maybe tolerated their presence? Right? I mean, again, those are very interesting questions to wrestle with, right? And we can also ask, since we are asking interesting questions here, if the Zionists would have acted differentially to the Arab customs, would that not have undermined the entire aim of Zionism, which was for the Jewish people to redefine itself and create itself anew as a vibrant and proud people, as we spent a whole session learning about and debating? So again, it's good that we wrestle with those questions because it's complicated, because it's really complex, right? And ultimately, we end up with the same question: was conflict avoidable? And as the Jews increasingly felt that it wasn't, especially during these first few years, right? 1919, 1920, 1921, right? As the Jews increasingly felt that it wasn't avoidable, right? That conflict seemed to be coming, that there was nothing maybe they felt they could do that would change that. Then their question then became, what do we do now? What do we do now with this shift, with this change in the data that we have, in this new information that we are getting? And you will read a lot about this in that chapter in Sachar's book. Again, read that one first. And if you have time, then push to the Segev account. He specifically talks about the three different riots. So he's zooming in on that. And again, he brings his own perspective on this. There is no history, as we are learning. There is only perspectives on history. There's only interpretations of history. This is it's like for all of us who thought that, well, there is history and there's only one history and it's told exactly. No, that cannot be the case. History is events that are understood and interpreted differently from different perspective at different times for different purposes, right? So that's why I brought both Segev and Shapira to show us, maybe more challenging perspectives in the narrative. But again, just that's their perspective. It doesn't mean that's their interpretation of the data, of the fact, of what they have studied, and what they see and they bring, to the story. So we read everyone with a grain of skepticism, and we just are grateful for the ability to gather all those perspectives so that we can make up our own mind, that obviously is infused with integrating all of those perspectives. I like also Shapira's little excerpt that I selected for you for this session, where she talks about what she names the defensive ethos. So again, she brings her own take on it, which in many aspects I disagree. But I think it's a shorter read. So if you don't have time this week, Sachar is your must. I would go to Shapira because she talks about a subtle aspect that I found very interesting, which is why I cut it out of the book and say, oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. And you will see specifically in that excerpt how the Zionists really wrestled with this, what she names and she coins to be the defensive ethos. Very, very interesting. Just another thing to add to your quiver, another arrow to add to your quiver. The last topic that I want to bring up in this session is about the British Mandate itself, and especially its great successes, because I think I've beaten on them at the beginning of the session. So I want to make it even a little bit. We can beat on them more later because they will deserve it, obviously. But there are great successes actually in the first decade of the British Mandate. Of course, there is Tel Chai, of course there is Nebi Musa, of course there is Jaffa, and they really failed to prevent that from happening or to intervene in really on time. But after Nebi Musa, the complaints of the Zionist movement and Weizmann get escalated drastically. Complaints exactly against the British military administration, and especially about their inability or unwillingness to protect the Jews. And those complaints multiply, and eventually they reach London. And once they reach London, Britain reverses course and dismantles the military administration altogether and appoint in its stead a civilian administration. The person that they appoint to lead in those first critical years is a British Jew, actually, whose name is Herbert Samuel. And he becomes the first British High Commissioner, that's his title, the British High Commissioner of Palestine in July of 1920. You can imagine that the Arabs opposed it, and you can imagine that the Jews welcomed him with enthusiasm until that those fateful riots in Jaffa, which basically marked the end a year later of the honeymoon, basically. But undeterred by his lack of welcome, by especially by the Arab population, Samuel gets to work immediately. He's very British and he's there to work. And, you know, if the Jews had hoped that they would find a friend in him, he's very much more British than he is Jewish, and he takes his assignment very seriously, and he tries to do it. Some would say to excess in an extremely fair way. You will that part is beautifully written by Sachar in that chapter. So um, I would let you discover what Samuel did. Um, I just mentioned a few things that jumped out for me. He created uh, a cadastral survey to a certain property, to a certain property rights and land holdings. I mentioned that the Ottoman took all their records with them, so he basically spent from the start, from the beginning, he understood that that would be a point of contention. So he recreated land records administration and property holding and land holding as his first order of business. So he did a whole survey and then he had the administrative part created. He created credit banks. He undertook a large program of public works, building roads, building roadways, building railways. He actually set up telegraph and telephone lines. He embarked on a project to drain the many malaria-infected swamps that were all over the land. He at first, and I mentioned that at first, opened the doors to Jewish immigration, which actually brought more Jews than ever before, to the point, as we will see, that Jewish population um, not doubled, but grew by a good third in the time of his leadership. And his obsession with fairness pushed him to a point, again, sometimes fairness is fairness, but his obsession with fairness pushed him to a point anti-Zionist, um, uh, anti-Zionist administrator in his government, especially the administration planner, who withheld, in fact, large block of state land from Jewish purchase, as well as we know, the Arabs themselves had instigated a sharp withholding of land sale to the Jews. So that was also a blow to the Zionists. Now they were hit on both sides. And this anti-Zionist administrator also established rigorous procedures for approving Arab land transfers to Jews. So he made it really difficult to acquire property and to acquire land. There were clear sympathies inside Samuel's administration for Arab nationalism. And if Jewish immigration, as I mentioned, was allowed, it was also very rigidly controlled. They instigated, for example, a requirement of proof of guaranteed employment in Palestine to allow Jews to immigrate, and started to, out of thin air, creates artificial quotas to curtail. Though they were open immigration, it was much more curtailed than Samuel probably would have wished. So yeah, you had to, if you wanted to immigrate, you have to prove that you had a job waiting for you. So, all kinds of roadblocks were promulgated. In March of 1921, then Colonial Secretary by the name of Winston Churchill, don't know if you heard of him, he was the colonial secretary at the time, so he came to explore Palestine as, one of the holdings of the crown. He came to explore Palestine. And when he was there, he reaffirmed, obviously, Britain's commitment to a Jewish national home. But in that month of March, he also announced to all that Jordan, what was called Transjordan at the time, was going to be separated from Palestine that now only pertained to the portion of the land west of the Jordan River. Transjordan was now all the territories east of the Jordan River. And he did this, he said, as a clarification of the Balfour Declaration, just to clarify what the Balfour Declaration really meant when it came to the territory that Palestine represented, right? Again, I mentioned, the land that was too many times overpromised, right? And here you go, right? It's already halved, right? So you will discover the reasons behind that in Sachar's chapter. But Transjordan was given to Abdullah, son of Sharif Hussein, brother of Faisal and Said, right? Hussein had many sons. And so Abdullah, who also took part of the Arab revolt during the war, by the way, not just Faisal, Abdullah was given Transjordan to rule over, while Faisal now ruled in Iraq. And Abdullah, of the Hashemite family of Hussein, was to reign over Transjordan as a British protege, right? Now, I understand that from the spring summer of 1921, and Abdullah made king of Transjordan. Understand that the Hashemite family and the descendants of Abdullah still are ruling over what's now called Jordan. Their line of kingship had persisted, and the Hashemite family, who came, from Arabia, right, are now have been ruling over Jordan. So really, we can say overall, right, that though Sharif Hussein himself didn't get all that he wanted, and wasn't able to create the pan-Arabic one state across the Middle East that he envisioned, that we saw at first through his letters and his exchange of letters with McMahon, Britain was, fairly accommodating to him and his sons, giving them both Iraq and Jordan to rule over. Of course, Faisal lost Syria, as we saw, to France. Hussein ends up losing his own kingdom to the Saudi tribe. But overall, they still got Transjordan and Iraq. Now, with Transjordan excluded from Palestine, the Balfour Declaration could no longer pertain to the territory of Palestine that you saw earlier. That was the map, the early map. And so this was a major concession to the Arabs. That concession on the side of Britain concerned the Jews, as you can imagine, greatly. Samuel now had to travel to London to ask for a definitive interpretation of the Balfour Declaration now that these moves had been made by Winston Churchill. And Churchill tasked Samuel to draft the document that he thought would be ideal as a declaration and to specify what the Balfour Declaration really was meant to say several years now later, and that Churchill, will review it and sign it. And that declaration that Herbert Samuel penned and Churchill signed is known as the Churchill White Paper. And I didn't share it with you. You can Google it if you want to see what was in it. But the highlights are that the document was absolutely devastating to the Jews. It was restricting the Jewish national home to the area west of the Jordan River. It abandoned the notion of creating a predominantly Jewish state, and it limited the immigration to, and I quote, the economic capacity of the country. Right? Now, Weizmann, who was confronted with this document, felt that the British winds of support were turning now against the Zionist project, and he thought it would be a strategic mistake at this point to reject the document, terrible as it was, because he feared even more to alienate Britain any further. He really felt that Britain had not turned against the Zionist project, so he signed reluctantly the document, the Churchill White Paper. And when it was presented to the Arab delegation, on the other hand, the Arab delegation rejected it altogether. They wouldn't even have that. And nevertheless, it became the official interpretation of the British Mandate as of July 1st, 1922, and that's what Samuel came back to the Promised Land with in his pocket. That was his, marching orders, basically, that he wrote himself, which is, kind of challenging, but here we are. Now, I don't have time here, obviously. We're running out of time tonight, but I can't lay out all the components of the mandate. Again, Sacha does a great job in his chapter to lay it all out. You will find it there. But I'm just going to highlight 3 things that I think need to be pointed out, and we'll close with that tonight. 1, Herbert Samuel was committed to democratic institutions, and he believed that if he could set up democratic institutions in the land under the British Mandate, it would ease the transition of the land to a democratic state as the British eventually would relinquish the mandate and leave in some shape or form ultimately. He strongly believed that he needed to establish those democratic institutions and to invite both Jews and Arabs to share in the political life of the mandate. And so a census is taken. A census is taken ahead of the proposed elections that were going to set up the democratic institution with, just as Europe had them, he wanted to create them there. The census reveals that at that time, in the early 1920s, there were in the land roughly 650,000 Muslims. Now, west of the Jordan, 650,000 Muslims, 87,000 Jews, and 73,000 Christians living in that land. Samuel proposes three forms of participatory governments. Why three? Because each three times, the Arab leadership completely refuses to participate. And so after three iterations, that we're more and more inviting to the Arab leadership, Samuel is devastated, is fed up, and he decides that what needs to be set up then in the land are the same institution as any other British colony around the world, which is, semi-military, right? And to him, that was a personal defeat, but he feels that he has no partner to invite into this process in the Arab, and so he has no choice but to fall back on some version of colony rule. Second thing, Samuel creates a full legal system based on British law, but keeping some of the Ottoman practices were relevant to the situation. And this mix of British and Ottoman law is still the base for Israeli law to this day. Three, Samuel creates a full taxation system. And that is set up throughout the shrunken land of Palestine. And it is so successful that really after just a couple years, Palestine becomes self-financed. Samuel's government is a boon to agriculture. It's a boon to overall modernization of the country. And with that, after 1921, after Jaffa, he is able to create in the land for almost the rest of the decade relative calm and peace, where the riots for the most part disappear, and both Arab and Jews take the time to build. And we will discuss what they did in the next session. So I hope all that I shared was absolutely clear. And let's see. The League of Nations are two separate organizations. No, the League of Nations was the organization that existed prior to the Second World War. The United Nations came to replace them. So I don't know if I misspoke. What is a dhimmi? I think I explained what a dhimmi is. It's second-class citizen under Muslim rule for non-Muslims, basically. All right, good. That's some good questions there tonight. Thank you for asking. Don't hesitate. Well, thank you, everyone. We're going to close tonight again with our Shalom chant. I always invite your further questions as you read through the material. You can always email me, and I make a point to reply to everyone. So never feel that you'll be left without an answer. I will do my best. All right, so we're going to close with a Shalom chant. inviting you to close your eyes again and to find your breath. And join me, if you so choose, for a threefold shalom chant. Shalom. 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 Thank you all. Good night, everybody.
Good night and thank you.
Moderne.
Modani. Thank you, Rabbi.
It was a good job, Olivier. As always, stellar.
Thanks.
I'm the one who asked the question about the League of Nations because,
Hang on. You can stay because this is still live streaming and I'm gonna stop that and say goodbye to all of you who are gonna watch this at a later time or are watching it live streaming. Good night to you. We'll see you next time.